It's Friday, and I'm back with the next in our Fanzine Friday series. Today we're taking a look at Thunderstruck number 5, the last issue of this fanzine from 1982. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer, and this is our channel Old School Rules, where we celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who like classic RPGs, miniatures, magazines, and everything that goes with it. Each week on the Fanzine Friday series, we take a fanzine from my collection off the shelf for a closer look, and today that's Thunderstruck number 5 from 1982. Hope you enjoy the video. So we're back with our next fanzine video, and it's the last one of 2023, and we're going to close out our look at Thunderstruck from the United Kingdom 1981 to 1982. This is Thunderstruck number 5. It's the smaller size. It's fairly common. Brown, heavy stock cover, regular white paper folded in half, stapled here. And again, this one has come out a little bit after Games Day 1982, and they talk in here about how it's been in production for over a year. So I'm thinking this is, I don't see it particularly dated, but probably I would put it in the fall of 1982. I think is when this one comes out. Remember, Tim Kalvis is the main driving force behind this, but he has contributions from a number of other people, and we'll talk about those here in just a minute. One of the people that helps him out, of course, are his artists, and he has art still from Alan Hunter, and also from Kevin Bulmer, and Kevin does the cover this time. So let's take a look at that. Here's the cover. It's sort of a sci-fi themed one, I would say. It looks like a moon. These guys are walking around this optical illusion that's continual upstairs, and then behind them is Death. I'm not sure what Death's doing on the moon, but there he is nonetheless. So kind of funky, kind of cool. We have several things here. We have the editorial where, he mentions that they've been producing Thunderstruck now for over a year, and he's really happy with the way things have developed, which is ironic because I think this is the end. But he's really happy about the fanzine that he's created, the support he's getting. And you'll see in here, and we talk about this, he's starting to get a decent amount of input and feedback from people around in the community. But as is so often the case, it seems like these guys just suddenly run out of energy or inspiration or whatever, and that's the end of their fanzine. He's very clear in here that he's trying to create a fanzine that it's sort of independent of any particular game, talks about anything going on in the hobby, and that he expects will evolve over time. And you can see here that he's starting to do that, right? Originally, it was just basically Dungeons and Dragons, and they moved some RuneQuest, some Traveler, and they're looking at other things that are going on in the role-playing game hobby. And again, he encourages people, to participate going forward. Bolts from the Blues, where they talk about new things happening in the hobby, new products, etc. Other Ways is an article that looks at suggestions for how to make your campaign better. It seems to be more focused on fantasy, but I guess not necessarily. The Keepers is a scenario for Traveler. The Dungeon comic, it's a new comic called The Dungeon. We'll show you that. The second part of the Runequest / D&D adventure, which is Mystery of Howlin Island. A letters column, which has some feedback from a number of people we've heard of before. You may know if you know much about fanzines. Reviews of some superhero games. We'll talk about Things Beyond, which is the regular Traveler sci-fi column. More discussion of samurai role-playing games. Eyeballs in the Sky, which is a kind of interesting article, and then some book reviews that did a couple of books that I'd never heard of. I think I'll tell you what they are. So those books were Book 2 of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, The One Tree, and then Life, the Universe, and Everything by Douglas Adams. So, in terms of contributors, Tim Kalvis puts the whole thing together. Articles by Robert McMahon, Paul Mason, Steve Donaldson, Tim Moyes, Marcus Rowland, and Stephen Hatherley, and then Alan Hunter and Kevin Bulmer do the artwork that's in here this time. Bolts from the Blue starts off with the discussion of some miniatures. Unfortunately, the I'll call it art, the illustration or whatever that was here, was a photograph of these miniatures, and it was so light in the actual page that when I tried to put a scan of it in here, it just completely washed out. But that's what those sort of squares are. Like I said, you can barely see it here on. You can sort of see it there on the page. You can actually see it there on the page about as well as I can with my eyeball. It talks about some new miniatures coming out from Citadel. Some particularly interestingly named individual ones that are part of box sets. And then he's got Chronicle miniatures, which has released a few. Dungeons and Dragons, TSR has a new module, B4, Lost City. Runequest has come out with some new products. And Solo Quest, that they've acquired Solo Quest to introduce you to the Runequest system. Troll Pack, which Tim Moyes took a look at, and it's another item for the Runequest game. And then Runequest has released Borderlands. Chivalry and Sorcery announced that it's coming out with the second edition later in the year. They say coming out in September, so that would sort of make me think this is probably, late summer, July, August time frame rather than that, right? Otherwise, I think they would have written it had come out in September rather than is coming out. And then there's the D&D multi-adventure books, the Dungeon of Dread. Remember, that's the pick a path, endless quest type of a book. And a universal fantasy scenario by Necromancer Publications called Quests for Adventures. 3 of these that are set in the Duchy of Glasden. Never really heard of that before. And then they make a mention of the Conan the Barbarian film, which they liked, but they say the critics did not. So unfortunately, we're stuck with that, right? But I think all of us, it's not a great piece of cinema, but it's a classic movie, if that makes sense. That's my view anyway. Other things coming out, Stay Beyond, which is a convention, and then there's a space opera adventure called Rosen 2 that's come out. And then in terms of zines, they have The Acolyte, The Abyss, Doom Book of Chaos, which we've talked about, Quasits and Quasars, which I only have 1 or 2 of those. We haven't talked about those yet. And then a book from Simon Billinus called 20 Years On, which is something I'm looking to see if I can find a copy of. And then finally, a new one from the United States called Olympus. And I've got a couple of those, and so maybe I'll do, I don't have them all, I think there's 5 or 6. So I haven't seen all those yet. Okay, other ways. This is Paul Mason's discussion of how to make your campaign better, essentially. He's got some feedback here from someone who had some ideas for him, one of which I thought was really interesting. He said, roll the complexity out slowly. And so he says, don't tell your characters, your players, about magic at first. Let them discover magic slowly, because he said that's maybe something that's a little bit more complicated. I think that's an odd idea. Well, for Dungeons and Dragons, right? Because clerics, magic users, are a pretty core part of the game. But maybe if you're playing a different type of game, it's not as big a deal. So Paul's article sort of focuses on what you should work out and when, what's important, right? Because you don't want to do everything. You don't want to be overwhelmed. You don't want to do a bunch of work that you never need. And so he says, think about who your players are. Get yourself a 3-ring binder so you can keep track of all the things you decide and write down, which is a really great tip, right? Even if you're an improvisational dungeon master or referee, as you create things, tell your players things. It's important to note that down in a way you can find it later. Like, who was that guy that I made up? What's the history of this thing that I created on the spot, right? You want to be able to keep track of that stuff, at least key details. So his idea is you start to create, one, focus on your rules, because you have to know your rule set, and you need to know things like, money, how people gain their abilities, whether that's skill point type system where you have to do training, or just magic users who have to have sort of a master who gives them their spell book, and clerics who get those from slightly older, more advanced clerics, etc. Develop your background, and again, do a little bit, do the sections you have to do, think about important events in history. Like he says, a lot of referees come up with ideas of a couple of key points in history. Maybe you're just coming off of a key point in history, or this adventure relates to something that happened a long time ago. So come up with those sort of key ideas about history. And like he says, you don't have to do it all at once, but you do have to do a little bit of it just to give your players some context. Same thing if you're going to have different races, whether those are player character races or things you might pose like goblins and orcs. make sure your players, especially if they're new, that you flush out a little bit so they get a sense of what those different type of groups of people or things that live in your world are and how they interact. Work on your monsters you're going to roll out. Like he said, you don't have to have 200 of them, 200 in your campaign. If played correctly, 3 or 4 key monsters can provide a lot of interest and excitement. Like he said, you're going to have humans, elves, dwarves, whatever in your adventures anyway, and they can provide a lot of interesting interactions for players. They can be opponents in something the characters are trying to achieve. And then some kobolds, some goblins, some orcs, if played richly, can be an important part of that, and you don't really need to dig into all 200 different types of monsters in your first few adventures. And then religion, he says, think about, do you really roll out the entire deities and demigods book with whatever that is, 400 or 500 different deities? Do you pick one? Do you create your own? What's going to make sense in your campaign? So again, that's the nice thing about these old articles. If they're thoughtful and well written, they're every bit as good in terms of advice or things to think about today as they were 30, 40 years ago. So then he has a couple crazy ideas here at the end, or just random ideas. He says you want to think about one, should we create a gaming system where we stop using dice? I would say no, because I love rolling dice. And then the other thing is, should your players be aware of all the rules or not? Right? Early on, Gary was sort of like, you guys playing don't really know all the rules. I know the rules, but you don't need to. I've heard people say they think that creates a much more immersive experience when they just tell you, like what Gary used to do, like, what do you want to do? You just tell me, right, narratively, and then I tell you what happens. There's no like, oh, I rolled an 18, so I'm successful kind of thing. Back then, the DM would roll all the dice, right? Interesting ideas. Maybe you don't want to do it, but interesting ideas nonetheless. We have if they call it a wacky traveler adventure called The Keepers. I don't play Traveler, but it's kind of an interesting one. Feels a little bit like Metamorphosis Alpha. There's a problem with the ship. You got to go into this. You find this ship. You got to go in and explore and find out what's happened and see if you can take care of the problem. I thought it was pretty good. Here's the ship you play on, and here's the artwork from that. That's Ballmer's art. I love this little amoeba thing with a hand reaching out, and then there's this other creature called the Moffat that's running around inside the ship. So here is the one-page comic called The Dungeon. This is Kevin Ballmer again, and it just has some characters in there. I love the fact that the guy's drinking mead. He's still holding his shield, right? He's ready for combat at any moment. And anyway, I'm not sure where this was going to go, but obviously there's not another issue of this fanzine, so I guess that's kind of the end of that comic. The Mystery of Howlin Island concludes. This is part 2. It's a fairly simple adventure. It doesn't get particularly complex. There's a couple of powerful undead. I mean, it's very, in a sense, I guess it feels sort of very real. There's just, there's these tombs. You go and you investigate them. There's going to be a couple of undead, no surprise. And then if you are so inclined, you can raid it and steal all the treasure that's down there. Because it's Runequest, I would say you would either want to maybe create your own undead creature to take what's there and make it appropriately difficult for your players, or maybe you can leave them alone, just sort of tune them up and down to make sure they fit the player characters that are in your D&D campaign. But straightforward, good, very well done. Here's the map of this area you're going to go to in the southern part of the island, and then there's this tower you're going to go in. So the letter column is quite interesting. You got a number of names in here, people talking about particular things in the fanzine and just the fanzine overall. Mark Gasquion, I may be mispronouncing that, Mike Lewis, Marcus Rowland, and Paul Mason. The last two are contributors to this. The first two are well known in the hobby fanzines. Pete Tamlin, Ivan Towson also write in, and Gary Gygax writes in, and his letter is a comment on the edited version of the interview that was published in issue number 4 of Thunderstruck, and he gave them high praise for doing a good job of excising the stuff he said that was just sort of uninteresting and really delivering what he thought was the right part of the interview to share with the public. And again, he's complimentary of the United Kingdom and his time there at Games Day. He said that players, he finds to be thoughtful, engaged and very creative group. Sort of compared, he says, he's complaining a little bit about the United States, where people don't necessarily think through what it is that they're arguing about all the time, or he doesn't agree with the logic of some of their ideas. It's very interesting to me that the UK can be quite cutting in their feedback. So a couple people complained about the interview that he didn't ask, quote, good questions or get Gary to share interesting information. One guy suggested he should ask Gary how much money he makes, which seemed inappropriate and not necessarily your business. And then when they sort of summed up their view, I mean, this one guy's like 2 out of 10. He's like incomprehensible pages. It feels like it's a really good fanzine, but when you really think about it, it isn't. That's one guy's comment. All right, but empty of content. I was kind of disappointed after I read it. In other words, you're getting there so much better than the abysmal issue number 3 you put out a little while ago. I mean, again, these are guys who are allegedly supporting him. They're taking the time to write in. But I've been told in the United Kingdom you get these very spirited back and forth between different editors, and everybody had their ideas that they were more than willing to share. So here's the review. He looks at 2 superhero games, Villains and Vigilantes and Champions, and he basically says they're both pretty good. He's more familiar with Champions. He likes the way their rule set is made better, but in the end he said they're both excellent, and he wishes there were more superhero games for people to sort of look at. Things Beyond, which is the look at sci-fi / traveler, encouragement. He's got all kinds of different stuff in here. He's got some suggestions. There's pictures of miniatures that are available, and talking about some products that may be coming out as well, including something called a game called Aftermath. Here's more discussion of samurai role-playing, and this one talks about the Bushido game and basically says it's excellent. And everything I've ever heard about that game, I don't have a copy of the rules. I might get them just to read them to see what they were like, because people just think this game was amazing. It's obviously very narrow, but I think the rules are really well written. There's an adventure for it called Valley of the Mist, which I have a copy of because I thought it might be interesting just as an adventure to look at. But they highly recommend. In fact, they say if you're going to get something, get Bushido instead of what we talked about last issue, because it's just the game's so much better. And finally, we have Eyeballs in the Sky, which is a discussion about having deities in your campaign. So it's very specific here, and this is more of a sci-fi probably game, because there was this, it looked like 2 ships that were spheres. So and the legend was these 2 spheres appeared. There was some lightning that went back and forth, and they disappeared. And then it rained, and they were in a drought, and so they thought the eyeballs in the sky were sort of deities had come, were the eyeballs of a deity had come and looked upon them with favor and caused it to rain. So just sort of a random one-off idea there. And here's the rear cover where they sort of put their, not table of contents, but list the contents that are going to be in there with some artwork. That's the rear cover of the fanzine. So let's take a look at the illustrations. These are the borders that Alan Hunter did. The one with the sort of skeletons or whatever is the role-playing game area for fantasy. So like the Howlin Island adventure has that. And then this other one is sort of a border that goes around the stuff when they're talking about a sci-fi campaign. And I thought that was kind of interesting idea to sort of signal to you whether you're looking at sci-fi or not. And here I just blew up the drawings on the side, these sort of funky spirits and skeletons that are there. Here's another Alan Hunter drawing. I'm not sure what this is. It looks like it's like a giant chicken feeder coming after this guy, but whatever it is, he's freaked out. He's on the ground. It looks like he's not going to survive. And then I just blew up the art that was on the rear cover. Classic Alan Hunter. You got the line work and then the different faces and things that appear tucked into that illustration. This is actually an advertisement for a games called Wonder World is the games company or the store, and blow it up here, this art. So this is just the art, like not for the fanzines, from the illustration for the advertisement, but I just thought it was kind of cool. You got this centaur warrior fighting this little tiny dragon creature here, kind of funky. Okay, so that is it for Thunderstruck number 5, the final Thunderstruck fanzine that I have, and the final fanzine Friday that we'll have for 2023. I will be off next week. I will be at Page, the Philadelphia Area Gaming Expo, which runs that weekend, like the 5th through the 7th, I believe it is. So if you're going to be there, hopefully we'll get a chance to see each other and chat a little bit about fanzines or games or just role-playing in general. And then I'll be back the following week. Or not. I think I'll be off for 2 weeks, actually. So I'll be back in January with a brand new fanzine. Till then, my friends, I hope you have a great new year. I hope 2023 was good for you and 2024 will be even better. Till next time, keep rolling 20s.